Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker and today's video is a continuation of my NBA season preview series for the 2019-20 NBA season, which is almost here by the way, and this one covers the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Timberwolves finished outside of the playoffs with a 36-46 record last season in a year that saw them weather all of the Jimmy Butler drama and ultimately move on from coach Tom Thibodeau. And unfortunately for a franchise that has only made the playoffs one time since 2004, even though this roster does have some talent on it, it doesn't look like it's going to be a great or playoff-worthy season from them in such a loaded Western Conference. But before we get into the season, let's go ahead and review their offseason, and of course I'm going to begin with Derrick Culver, who the team moved up to select with the 6th overall pick, and at the time I put out some videos saying that I really didn't think this was a great move, but it didn't have a lot to do with Derrick Culver. It had to do with the circumstances of draft night, because the Timberwolves moved up to 6th and then Darius Garland was picked at 5 after they had already traded up, and then there were reports that they were trying to move back down from 6. So it seemed like they moved up to select a player that was picked right in front of them, and then they ended up taking their second choice in Derrick Culver. But that's nothing against him as a player, because he certainly does have a good amount of upside as a guard/wing combination. He's got good length, good size, should be a good to great defender in the NBA as long as he figures it out, as long as he learns the NBA game, and as long as he bulks up a little bit. Offensively, not as much upside just because he needs to work so much on his handle and on his skills and as a shooter, but certainly has the tools at his disposal to be a rotation starter, potentially all-star level guard moving forward. Even though if I don't necessarily see those things from him anytime soon, I do think at minimum he should end up being a starting caliber 2 or 3 in the league, even though I don't think he's going to be anything super special for this Timberwolves team in the long run. And then beyond that, in terms of additions, that's definitely the most exciting one, because now you get to guys like Noah Vonleh, who they brought in free agency, left the New York Knicks, actually had a pretty good season for them, and Vonleh signed such a low minimum salary deal with this team because even though he was productive, it was in New York last year and he had plenty of opportunity. But I do actually like the addition, someone that provides this team versatility in the front court, can shoot a little bit, good defender, kind of a combo 3-4 guy. Again, just provides them versatility and depth in their rotation, which once we get to their depth chart, you'll see they certainly do need. Next up now, in kind of a similar role to Vonleh, is Jordan Bell, though obviously he did not have nearly as productive of a season a year ago. This is a player that looked really promising as a rookie with Golden State, and then after that really didn't get a ton of minutes for them, and is just really undersized for the positions and the roles that he's asked to fulfill to this point in the NBA. He's not skilled enough to play the 3 and has to really play the 4 and sometimes even the small ball 5, and again just doesn't bring a ton of skill to the table in terms of being a shooter and things like that. He's a great athlete. He's someone that can do a lot of things versatility wise on the defensive end, but just doesn't provide enough offensively outside of finishing at the rim to really warrant a ton of minutes. But I do like the move for Minnesota in terms of potentially seeing what they can get out of him and him maybe being a longer term piece if he can develop those skills. Moving on now to a player that was actually brought in a sign and trade, and you can see the contract numbers on screen, and that is Jake Layman. This is a player that showed some promise at times for the Trailblazers and looked like at times potentially a longer term piece for that team on the wing. They decided to move on from him, and I'm interested to see what he does in Minnesota, because I do certainly think that he has talent as a shooter, maybe even a little bit as a playmaker as well, and I definitely think it's worth the less than $4 million a year investment on the part of Minnesota to see what they can get out of Jake Layman. He's going to get minutes on this team. He's going to be part of the rotation. So if he's going to be something in the NBA, whether it be a rotation caliber wing, whether it be a starting caliber wing, we're going to find out in his time in Minnesota. Again, he needs to be able to knock down jump shots consistently. He needs to show a little bit of playmaking, a little bit of attacking closeout stuff, things like that, and improve as a defender. And I think those are all realistic possibilities for him in Minnesota. And so I'm interested to see if he capitalizes on that and takes advantage of the opportunity. And then last up now in terms of additions is a player that I actually just talked about in a season preview, and that is Shabazz Napier. From a per game statistical productivity standpoint, he was relatively productive, but as always in his career, efficiency was an issue. But if you're looking for someone to bring off the bench that's going to provide some offense, that's going to be able to knock down shots on occasion per game, then Shabazz Napier isn't a bad option, and this team certainly needed a backup at the point guard spot, so I don't blame them at all for bringing him in. Moving on now to the subtraction category, in which there are actually a couple of relatively significant ones for this team, and the first is Derrick Rose, who had a really nice bounce back season in Minnesota last year, signed a new contract to go play for the Pistons. And this is a guy that just suddenly found a way to become a good three-point shooter, and that raised his efficiency across the board as well as his productivity last year in Minnesota. Now, certainly he had plenty of opportunities on a team that definitely doesn't have a ton of playmaking on the perimeter outside of Rose, Teague, and then sometimes Andrew Wiggins. So he definitely got plenty of opportunity to, like I said, increase that productivity. But just how good he was as a three-point shooter compared to his career average was really the most significant upgrade for him. And this team, in my opinion, is going to miss that playmaking and that scoring because they didn't really do much to replace it. Next up now, another backcourt player that they lost, and this is Tyus Jones, who is now in Memphis. And I think at a certain point, this just came down to the fact that Minnesota did not want to pay what Memphis was willing to bring back Tyus Jones. This is a pretty significant offer for a player that really hasn't shown a ton from a statistical standpoint to this point in his career. He looks like he should be a solid rotation point guard, can be a bit of a playmaker off the bench for your team, but I'm not sure that that's worth a over $7 million a year investment, or even more than that, like Memphis put in to Tyus Jones. So I don't necessarily blame the Timberwolves for letting him leave given the contract that he was offered by Memphis, and I don't blame them at all for not matching that. But from an on-court perspective, they're going to miss his ability to make some plays, to create for others in place of someone like Shabazz Napier that they brought in this year. It would have been better to have Jones, but again, when it comes down to it, the price just wasn't worth it. Next up now in terms of subtractions is a player that I had high hopes for once he was moved to Minnesota and never really capitalized on that, and that is Dario Saric, who was used to move up to the 6th overall pick in addition to Minnesota's own 11th overall pick to go and get Culver, and Saric is now in Phoenix. Like I said, I had high hopes for this player once he kind of moved out of Philly, was on a team that maybe fit his style a little bit more, needed his playmaking a little bit more rather than just being a three-point shooter. And I'm still holding out hope that that's something that we're going to see more in Phoenix this year, because I do think Saric is a talented player. But whether it was utilization, whether it was just an overall unhappiness with the situation, whatever it was, Saric certainly did not have a great season last year from a statistical perspective, and I'm hoping he'll turn it around in Phoenix this year. But I don't blame the Timberwolves at all for moving on from him, even though his value is probably at his lowest at the time that they moved him at the draft. And the last up, kind of a veteran front court presence, and that is Taj Gibson. They have the players to provide front court depth. They brought in some guys, and they still have Gorgui Dieng to play the backup five. This isn't a huge loss from an on-court perspective, but from a veteran leadership standpoint, Taj Gibson is a nice guy to have around, an old Tom Thibodeau guy. But again, don't blame them at all for moving on from him, especially given the fact that the Knicks gave him a contract worth $10 million a year. He's certainly not worth that to Minnesota, so it's completely fine that they let him go, again, because they do have people to replace him. Moving on now to the depth chart, and I have Jeff Teague, Jarrett Culver, Wiggins, Covington, and Towns as the starters. Then off the bench, Napier, Okogie, Layman, Vonleh, and Gorgui Dieng. And some of you at first might say, why in the world is Robert Covington playing the 4? Well, that's just kind of the way this team is set up at this point, and I think it's definitely realistic to expect Covington to play the 4. That kind of stuff really isn't that big of a deal anymore in the NBA. A lot of times people in the comment section, like for the Celtics one, I had Jaylen Brown playing the 4. It really doesn't matter who I put at those numbers 2 through 4 in today's NBA. As long as you're matched up properly defensively, as long as they have relatively good size, you'll see teams running 4 guards out there in a big. So the 1 through 4 spot in terms of the number isn't all that critical, and I think it's definitely realistic to expect Covington to play the 4 because I think that is this team's best lineup, and that's what I'm trying to put together when I'm looking at the starters. Teague provides some playmaking, Culver is the defender, Wiggins can provide some scoring, Covington can be a really good two-way player, defender, shooter, things like that, and then Towns obviously is the big post presence. My big issue for this team is when you look at what they have coming off the bench, because I struggled to even put together a 1 deep rotation at each position for this Timberwolves team. The strongest parts of the bench, I guess, are Okogie and Layman. Okogie, someone I'll talk about a little bit later. Then I already discussed what I think Jake Layman could do for this team this year as well as moving forward. Beyond that, you've got Dieng, who certainly has a big salary, but doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be a highly productive player for this team. Has always showed promise as someone that can be a really good high-energy big off the bench, but consistency and skill set have been an issue. And then you're relying on guys like Shabazz Napier and Noah Vonleh, who are on relatively low 1-year deals that you sign over the offseason to provide depth at the 1 and 4 spots, respectively. So as a starting group, I don't have a ton of issues with what this team has put together. I'd like to have a better one than Jeff Teague, and you guys obviously know how pretty much everybody feels about Andrew Wiggins at this point, but Towns should be able to lift up the play of a lot of those other guys. Culver provides them upside, as well as another really good defender outside of Robert Covington in theory. But when you're looking at that bench unit, it's not pretty at all, and that's one of the main things that, in my opinion, brings down the ceiling and the upside of this team in terms of their potential win-loss record, is just how poor their depth and their bench looks to be. Moving on now to the players to watch section, and it's pretty simple for me. It's got to be Josh Okogie, because as you look up and down this roster, unless you're going to talk about Jarrett Culver, who everybody's going to be talking about as a high draft pick for this team, in terms of high upside young players moving forward, Josh Okogie is pretty much the only guy to talk about. I mean, obviously you have Towns, everybody knows about him. Wiggins is still relatively young, but Okogie is the one player that could really provide another piece to this quote-unquote young core, if you want to call it that, for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Such a high energy player, such a good defender, someone that on occasion when you pop on a Minnesota Timberwolves game throughout the year last year, you see this guy really flash on the screen as a defender, just bringing so much energy. Needs to improve, obviously, efficiency-wise from the field as well as from three, but if he can do those things, this is a guy that you will love to have on your team, especially on a team that looks to be going in kind of a younger direction here over the next couple of years. Having a player like Josh Okogie that has such a great work ethic is huge for this team, but he needs to continue to improve on the floor from the offensive side of the floor, in terms of his overall skill set as well as his shooting, so they can actually be on the floor and be productive and be a valuable member on offense rather than just a Tony Allen defensive energy type guy. But definitely someone to keep an eye on, because if he does make a leap offensively, then that not only makes a huge difference to the long-term prospects of this team, but also really improves the bench, because unless he's starting over Culver, I would expect Okogie to be their sixth man of sorts this season. So keep an eye on him. And then last up now, we get to expectations and predictions, and it's pretty simple for this Timberwolves team. Expectations wise, I do not expect them to be a playoff team at all. And then in terms of my predictions, I've got them at 32 to 35 wins, and the amount of promise for this season really depends on how well Jarrett Culver plays. That's really the thing that can give this team a ton of hope beyond this year, is if Jarrett Culver looks like a really good player off the jump, because I don't think that there's going to be anything else on the court that's really going to provide a lot of hope to this fan base. I mean, Towns is going to be what he is. Wiggins is going to be what he is. Towns is obviously an outstanding young player, but I don't think just him by himself with these pieces around him is enough to get them close to playoff contention in a tough Western Conference. If this was in the East, I've said this about a couple of different teams in the West, if they were in the East, they'd have a shot at the 8th seed, but in the Western Conference, it's just too tough. They don't have the talent. They don't have the depth. But again, if Jarrett Culver looks like a really good player, someone that this team could potentially build around on the perimeter, that changes everything about the future of this franchise. But if he looks like just another guy, then the Timberwolves likely will be somewhere in the 5 to 8 range once again in the draft, and then kind of just looking for what's next for this team, and potentially a Karl Anthony Towns trade in the future if things go very badly. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.